You're listening to In the Spotlight with Jill Nicolini on Business Talk Radio, where we take your business to the next level. Jason Bohn, are
Hello.
you with us?
I am.
AnxietyCenterKC.com. Welcome to the show. Please say hello and introduce yourself.
Hello, I am Jason Bohn. Been working with adolescents and their families for close to 30 years now. I run, with my wife who founded the center, I run a counseling center and an intensive outpatient program for adolescents struggling with anxiety, depression, ADHD, avoidance, lots of the suicidal ideation and self-harm that kind of makes it into the media. That's what we deal with.
Interesting. The website, AnxietyCenterKC.com. And what is your other site?
Yeah, boldparenting.online if they want to go specifically there. But I've now linked everything through the Anxiety Center KC website. So we're good to go either way you find us. AnxietyCenterKC.com.
Great. And for today's show, what did you have in mind for enlightening our listeners?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the dark side of avoidance. You know, avoiding things feels really good in the moment, but there's really a dark side as you learn the process, especially young children and then adolescents learn the process of avoiding things.
Right. Let's talk, because we all procrastinate and avoid it at times, I'll be honest.
Yeah. So avoidance is what we do when we don't want to engage in some situation, activity, or behavior. Avoidance, like many things, is a two-edged sword or a lightsaber, given the title, The Dark Side of Avoidance. Avoidance of dark alleys and offers from Nigerian princes. That's a good thing. There's lots of things we should probably avoid, unhealthy relationships. There are things we should be avoiding, snakes and things that might be dangerous. But avoidance of work, staying home from school, or skipping class is not a good idea. These types of avoidance are obvious, but avoidance can also be really subtle, like avoiding eye contact when giving a presentation, falling asleep in class, or suppressing a painful thought or feeling with drugs or alcohol. One thing that's really for sure is that avoidance usually feels really good in the short term. So I am nervous about going out on maybe a blind date, and I choose to cancel and say I'm sick, and I get rid of all of that fear and anxiety for a little while, and I'm comfortable again. And so it feels really good in the moment, but then you got to think about long term what was given up to do that. And some of those types of things that get avoided, and this is where, I come always from an adolescent perspective for the most part, is that there are things that we don't typically think about being avoided that get avoided because they feel good. One, physical activity. There is so much research suggesting that physical activity is good for depression and almost anything in our lives. We just feel better when we get the chemical releases that come from physical activity. So avoiding physical activity, avoiding social interactions or social situations, avoiding scary things. And scary is just this big class that literally covers from phobias to I'm afraid to feel love because I've been abandoned in my life. Things that are harder to see are avoiding responsibilities. And getting into the head that that's too big of a risk I can take, so I'm just going to avoid responsibilities because I could clearly fail. Avoiding parental interactions that can look as simple as a young kid, a teen with AirPods in, or playing on a video game or watching shows on their thing, but you're avoiding parental interactions. Interactions with authority, so teachers, people at your dance studio or at the club. You just get to where I don't want to deal with any authority because they're going to have an expectation on me that might not feel good or I might not live up to. I think we all try to avoid physical pain when possible, and we do things to avoid that. But then there's a really big category of emotional pain. Like, I've been rejected by somebody else and I don't want to even accept or put myself in a situation where I might have that emotional pain again. Conflict. If we know it's going to be conflictual, we might do things to avoid it. We do things to avoid challenges. I don't want to take the risk to take challenges. And then we avoid lots of things, or our adolescents avoid lots of things that could bring them vitality and value. It just takes effort and time that they don't really want to put in because of the risk of failure. So those are a big set of categories that are just different from typical exposure helpful activities. Like I'm scared of snakes. Well, I can help you get to where you could go to a zoo and go to a snake cage, or I'm afraid of buses or planes or something. Those are true anxiety producing and avoidance, but there are lots of other things. If we start wanting to avoid our thoughts, and this is where a lot of young people struggle, is I want to avoid my thoughts, so I distract myself all the time. And then it's super hard to go to sleep because my thoughts are just running wild and I don't like it. And it's telling me, that I'm not good enough and that maybe I should just give up. Does that make sense as far as a category and why I think there are things that we just don't normally think about that can be avoided, especially things we can't even see on the outside?
Got it. Absolutely.
Great. Well, Garland, Fox, and Williams in 2002 laid out 5 areas of adolescent development that get altered during times of mental illness. So if, even if it's COVID driven at this point, but if your young person is struggling, there's 5 areas of their development that gets altered. And altered usually means delayed or sent in a different direction. But first there's, life situations, relationships, and practical problems. Like there are things in an adolescent's life that are supposed to happen during this time, and they're supposed to learn how to deal with those life situations and relationships, and that gets altered if there are mental health challenges. Altered thinking is number 2. So struggling, you tend to lean towards extreme thoughts, unhelpful, or self-defeating thoughts. And we had a whole talk, and on the website you can reach a talk on defense mechanisms, which are once it's moved to a behavioral stage and you're doing defense mechanisms to avoid things, you're really doing self-defeating behaviors. Third area that can get altered during times of mental illness or times of struggle is altered emotions. So moods or feelings that may or may not be present or may not be as extreme as they are, gets altered during times of struggle. Fourth is altered physical feelings, symptoms. So when a young person's struggling, any physical sensation is like amplified. And then finally, altered behavior or activity level. And we're going to spend a little more energy on that one today. But in times of struggle, you just don't behave or do the same level of activity you do in those time periods. Yeah. And so let's start. But both depression and anxiety make things harder, including the stuff we used to enjoy, and feed into an avoidance cycle that has to be disrupted. Unfortunately, both depression and anxiety, which are just slightly different cycles, can join forces and become exponentially more challenging, impacting motivation, self-care, and all relationships. It becomes harder to determine the underlying cause when those two things start getting mixed up, because depression in adolescence regularly looks a lot like irritability. And then irritability gets mixed in with some other things in anxiety and fear. So that's when it starts getting really complicated and impacts self-care, relationships, also and it really takes change. It requires skill development to change what those areas of development that were altered. It takes therapy and or medication to bring balance back to those forces. When people feel depressed, the presence of biological symptoms of depression, again, this is the altered feelings coupled with negative thoughts and perceptions. And we've talked about the advisor from the DNAV model from Hayes and Ciaraci, that we consider this inner voice to be the advisor, and the emotional state in which little is enjoyed. That happens in depression. So an altered emotional feelings again. It results in restriction of activities that they used to do that they feel able to engage in. So this would be like a friend calls you up and says, hey, let's just go biking this weekend. And you're like, well, I'm depressed, so I don't feel like doing that. So you don't. At that point, you have reduced your total activity. You have then had a loss of things that used to give you fun, pleasure, and or a sense of achievement that actually worsens how you feel and plays into the depression that then leads to more reduced activity and achievement. And so that's where that cycle around depression starts. For anxiety, when people become anxious, their advisor recommends they avoid places and situations where they predict that anxiety will occur. This avoidance adds to their problems because although they may feel less anxious in the short term, in the long term, this behavior maintains and worsens their problem. The avoidance exasperates anxiety, further undermines confidence in their ability to do things, and results in increasingly restricted lifestyle ruled by fears. And so anxiety leads to avoid scary things, leads to reduced activity, increased restricted life, and undermines confidence. All those things pour back into worsening of how you feel. That pours into more anxiety, more wanting to avoid scary things. And again, you've got a really, a dark side just cycle that's going downhill. Avoidance also teaches an individual that the unhelpful rule that the only way to deal with a difficult situation is to avoid it. And so that's where learning comes into play. And we all recognize this in our really young children. So they were crying because they actually fell off their bike and got hurt and they've got a scraped knee. And, after you've comforted them everything, you go ahead and give them a cookie. Well, incredibly enough, the next time they want a cookie, they're like, well, maybe if I cry and act hurt, I'm going to get a cookie, because they learned from that behavior. So if you avoid something and it feels good, the sad thing is you also learn I can feel better if I avoid things. And that turns into a really, really vicious cycle of unhelpful behavior. All right. And where adolescents act, much like fleas in a circus. And I really like this example. Flea circuses existed from the 1820s to the 1860s. One of the ways fleas were trained was by capturing them inside a jar. The fleas would jump and slam into the lid, and after multiple attempts, learn to control their jump to the size of the jar. So they literally jumped just shy of banging their heads and hurting themselves. At this point, once all of them were doing that same thing, at this point, the fleas could be dumped out on an open table, and the fleas would never jump higher than they had inside the jar. In psychological jargon, this is called learned helplessness, which explains much of the behaviors of struggling teenagers. Because of their condition, their advisor has learned to avoid painful thoughts, feelings, or experiences through the use of unhelpful behaviors, which we'd call defense mechanisms and avoidance. This in turn leads to new or worsened problems, which leads to a worsening of how they feel, thereby strengthening the depression, anxiety, which can lead to a downward spiral of emotions and crises such as dissociation or suicide attempts. Is that making sense? Yeah, and it's really hard to determine which is which and at what point. I had a parent support group last night and just talking about how hard it is to differentiate risky behavior just because they're an adolescent sneaking out and taking a car, and which is based on their impulsivity or their depression or their anxiety. And so those really get mixed up, and there really has to be some really understanding of your young person, detaching from them and then helping them to overcome. And so that's where I want to go next, is overcoming that cycle.
And Jason Bohn, we welcome you back to the show here, anxietycenterkc.com. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. We've been talking about the dark side of avoidance that happens when young people or teenagers are struggling, and just how that ends up reducing any value or vitality that they get out of life. It just worsens the symptoms and just keeps this downward spiral going. And so I want to talk about overcoming that cycle, and it really requires moving out of one's comfort zones. And again, at my website you can find some images and look at this. But you get this comfort zone, this is where I feel safe. And sadly, in young people who are avoiding stuff, it starts narrowing and narrowing until we hear about stories. And I deal with stories of young people who have limited themselves to their basement and video games and watching shows, and really are only comfortable in that space. They feel safe and controlled. And outside of that is kind of this fear zone, and you've got to move through that zone. That lack of self-confidence. There's a lot of finding excuses in that. You're really affected by other people's opinions, and so that's the fear zone. That's really kind of like a rocket ship has to have extra boost to get out of the atmosphere, and then it doesn't take as much energy. Getting through that fear zone is where you've got to really push and add energy, and maybe get help and support from the outside, from a counselor or an intensive outpatient program like we run. Then you shift into the learning zone, where you're learning how to deal with challenges and problems. You're acquiring new skills. You're extending or expanding that comfort zone of things that are just comfortable to do. And then the long-term goal is to build towards a growth zone, and knowing how to get into a growth zone where you find purpose, you live out your dreams, you set new goals, and really are able to conquer objectives. One way to do this, to get through that vicious cycle, can be overcome by creating a step-by-step plan. And if it's a phobia, working with snakes or airplanes or something like that, that's an exposure ladder that you build. But when you're avoiding other things, it's a step-by-step plan to reintroduce those things into life that previously gave a sense of pleasure or achievement. That step-by-step plan needs to include steps to test out and challenge the self-created rules that often drive the avoidance, and to face up to feared situations. Much like knowing that the Death Star has a weakness, disrupting this cycle is easier said than done. They even had blueprints, and it was still a big challenge. There are real symptoms of lack of energy, panic, suppressed emotions, and all those invisible triggers inside a young person's head that they attempt to avoid, and then they use defense mechanisms that just get in the way. Those have to be overcome. These are developmental delays of knowing how to create new relationships. I mean, if a young person has been struggling since they were 14 till when they were 16, they lost a really key period where everybody else learned how to make friends as an adolescent. And now we're saying, well, you need friends, and hoping to toss them back into the water. We've got to give them some skills to be able to do that because of the years of avoidance. And avoidance feels really good in the moment, whether that's not attending class or smoking weed to numb the pain, and really that just reinforces the avoidance cycle. So to develop a growth ladder, and we got much more detailed directions on the website kind of thing, but we call it a growth ladder, and you try to develop your strengths or your values or overcome fears through exposure, gradually doing new things or facing the things that you fear. So step one is choose a single goal, not a huge mammoth goal. Choose a single goal. I am going to start talking to people. Step two, brainstorm 10 plus steps, behaviors that might move you towards that goal, or you would imagine moving you towards that goal. Then you want to consider what thoughts, behaviors, actions get in the way of that value, strength, or goal. Rank your steps, rate your steps, give them a 1 to 10, 1 being super easy, or 0 being, yeah, I can already do that, that's in my comfort zone, to 10 being, that seems super scary, unwilling to try that today. All right, at that point, you then put them in order and you start with the lowest number. You start with the least challenging step and repeatedly enter that situation or do that activity, even if you feel strong emotions, including depression and not wanting to do it. Once you can face that thing or situation repeatedly, it's time to celebrate your victory and move on to the next thing in your list. Very important to track progress. This might be somebody that journals or just notes, hey, I did that this day, and then reward yourself. Find a reward. They're not huge rewards, but maybe I went biking, so I do get that chocolate chip cookie now, or I'm gonna hold off ordering something that I really want, a new album or something, until I've accomplished this goal. And so again, we've put some materials out on the website to help support that. Regardless of label, anxiety or depression, the cycle of avoidance can be disrupted. Along with helping young people and families develop step-by-step plans, we teach the BOLD process, which is breathe, observe, listen to your values, and decide on actions and doing them. This is a process for making wise mind decisions. And I think that's what I'm going to talk about next week, is really going deep into that and how to apply it, because it engages the noticer, the valuer, and the discoverer, which we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, and helps to unhook from that inner voice, that advisor, as they move towards what matters to them. And so I think we'll talk more in depth about BOLD and how to apply that and what skills are part of that next week. But do you have any questions about that?
I don't think much to share. I think it's important, people, that you come on the radio every week and you have such in-depth topics, and clearly your passion of helping young adults, adolescents with so much, and people in general. It really makes a difference. And I'm glad that we could, host your platform here so you can get this information across. It's vital. And I want to just thank you for always doing that for us, Jason.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you and your willingness to listen and play around with my experiments, and it's made it easier.
Oh, well, thank you so much. My goodness. We still have 2 minutes left in the show. Okay. So what else do you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, I think there's a thought that if you can recognize, well, I talked with a mom last night, and she's really struggling with her kid, and they've gotten to a place for lots and lots of reasons that the young person actually wants to avoid their relationship with their mom. And the mom feels like they've done a poor job, and there's pieces of their life that would, you can say, yeah, that added up to some of the struggles you're dealing with. But she started recognizing that her daughter, like, she wanted her daughter to go cook or help with dinner or something like that, and cutting up vegetables. And she's like, wow, I've literally never taught this to her. And how could I possibly expect her to know how to do this? And that is an amazing mindset to greet and meet your adolescent or even your younger children. It goes back to one of the talks we did, to assume it's a skill deficiency, like they just don't know how to do it, and that I'm going to invite them in and I'm going to show them the steps and I'm going to teach them so they learn how to learn. And what I shared with her last night is, you are building a process that will lead to her believing she can learn from you. And then she will ask the questions that will kind of feel more like that emotional attachment that you want. And it needs to kind of start, just like defense mechanisms are active ways to avoid, it has to start with active ways to re-engage that feel safe, that stay in that comfort zone, that still move that boundary out and about. And I really think that's that learning mindset, that I'm going to teach my young person, whatever their age, a skill step by step, from little bits to big bits, and not just expect them to be good at things, is really an amazing mindset to greet your young person with.
Well, thank you again, Jason. And I want to point out the website, anxietycenterkc.com. We could reach Jason there. And do you want to also leave the other website or a phone number?
Sure. boldparenting.online is a source you can get to kind of the materials I've got for parents and for teens. And I can be reached at jason@anxietycenterkc. It's easier to email any of us. Phones are not the friends of counselors.
I agree. Yeah, you're always busy, and it's better. I'm with you 100% than broadcasters. Well, Well, thank you again for joining us today, and we welcome you again and our listeners to continue to listen. I will have more coming right up after this quick break. Don't go.